It's fantastic to be here at the Aquarium. I'm really excited. Thank you for that great introduction. What I'm going to do is start with a 2-minute video that I made for the book, which gives you a good overview. It has moving sharks as opposed to the shark pictures I'll have later. So I feel like never pass up a chance to see moving sharks, particularly right now there aren't sharks in the tanks here, and so this gives you a little shark appetizer for then when I will go on for my talk. So
Ashley's going to turn off the lights. So
oh, okay.
I think she's going around. Yep.
Okay. Something needs to be done about the. It's the volume.
Just turn off the time. Turn off in the true sense of the word. You can't help but be struck by how beautiful these animals are and how perfectly designed they are for what they do. They are hunters who are unparalleled. It's incredible when you think these are animals that evolved long before dinosaurs, and yet they are so honed towards survival that they have managed to stay around with us for all this time. They're so different in how they approach the world, but at the same time, we're linked to them. The bones in their ear came from sharks, so did the muscles that we use to chew and to talk. We don't actually understand the extent to which we're the predators now in the sea. Sharks are able to regulate the entire food chain below them, and when you take them out, everything gets out of order. There's a whole underworld where a single shark on the fin market could go for $57,000. There are closed-door auctions where, with the clicking of the advocates, the fate of all these sharks is determined by the highest bidder. When I was able to get into the ocean and really see what's down there and what is hidden from our view, I was hooked. I just thought, here's this completely separate universe, this totally different way of existing, and you get a passport to it from time to time, and that's an incredible thing. Demon fishing is actually a phrase that someone mentioned when I was traveling in New England, that they've become the demon fish to recreational fishermen there. And I thought it was a great way to capture how we misunderstand them. And ultimately, this book in some ways is about unpacking the myth that surrounds sharks and giving you a sense of what these creatures actually are.
Why are we obsessed with sharks? This is something that, it's also very interesting because I'm not, believe it or not, obsessed with sharks. I think they're interesting. I obviously devoted 4 years of my life to writing this book, but I don't, as many people have asked me, live every week like it's Shark Week, whatever that means. But frequently, in the course of writing this book, when I told people I was writing a book on sharks, the immediate reaction was, oh my God, I'm fixated on sharks, or my 11-year-old's obsessed with sharks, or what have you. So this is clearly, and it's across countries, it's across cultures, people are obsessed, and I wanted to figure out what this was about. Now, if you look back historically, and you look at island cultures and kind of what are kind of our early views of sharks, what you find is they were often central in faith traditions and in the understanding of island nations in terms of why things happened, explaining actions that might have in many ways seemed inexplicable. They were really something that mattered, and these island nations and cultures were obviously much more connected to the sea than we are now for the most part. And so what you saw is that they came up with a very detailed understanding of the role that sharks played and so forth. And so that's one of the at that point they had a much more nuanced view of sharks. Now, for example, the Hawaiians have shark guardian angels, and in fact, Hawaiians have one of the most detailed worldviews when it comes to sharks, and they saw a connection. And what's interesting, it was a highly personalized connection. Individual families would have these shark guardian angels called amakua, which in their view would do everything from protect them when they were out at sea. This is not uncommon. The Japanese had a shark that did this, or would determine what kind of fish catch they got. They could use it to get kind of outcompete their neighbors by saying, I have this shark deity that's looking out for me. So it was an incredibly personalized, almost individual relationship that they had with sharks. And when you get beyond what we saw in Pacific Island nations, then you looked at how did the Greeks look at them. And interestingly, the Greeks portrayed them often in their art. There's Phoenician pottery dating back to 3000 BC, where they showed images of sharks, and there's a vase from 725 BC in Italy, which shows a fish resembling a shark attacking a man. So with them, it was less about the supernatural, although there were slight connections to that, but it was, in many ways, they used their art to detail, frankly, what were probably real experiences that happened. And so, for example, with the Greeks, they had images of something called katia, which was a shark-like creature that the Greek poet Appian described as a species that, quote, raved for food with unceasing frenzy, being always hungered and never abating the gluttony of their terrible maw. For what food shall be sufficient to fill the void of their belly, or enough to satisfy and give respite to their insatiable jaws? So this was a moment where, you know, they saw them as having incredible powers and ones that they frankly directed against humans, as opposed to having kind of a relationship where there was a give and take. Now, Aristotle also, in fact, provided the first account of shark sex that we have in recorded history. So this was a moment where you actually saw a more observational relationship with sharks, where they were recounting what would happen, and he talked about how they copulated in the fashion of dogs, and in fact, he gave a term dogfish, which still describes, say, spiny dogfish that swim off these shores. And so really he also talked about salace sea fish, which became part of their scientific nomenclature. And so that was a moment where you really saw people trying to, you know, make sense of them in the natural world, in their natural surroundings. But one of the interesting things that happened, and I really discovered this through researching this book, is that the Western world forgot about sharks in the Middle Ages. Obviously, in many ways, the economies of the world moved from being dominated by some of these island societies to, of course, Europe and so forth. And at that point, what was really interesting is there was much more of an emphasis on the forest. If you look at, you know, kind of the literature at that time and the accounts of that time, they're really much more focused on that part of the natural world. And they quite literally forgot that sharks existed, to the extent that, for example, they had shark teeth, fossilized shark teeth, that they would dip in their goblets when they were celebrating with festivities, and they referred to them as dragon tongue stones, and had this perception that these were in fact dragons that they had found the remnants of, rather than sharks. And this break was really critical, because it was at the moment, really, that the Western world forgot about sharks and later was reintroduced to them, that they basically lost any sense of nuance and instead were open to the idea that these could be truly malevolent creatures. That really happened when the West rediscovered sharks through seafaring, and essentially, you know, what you saw happen there was that, for example, the first account of a shark strike is in the late 1500s, when a Portuguese sailor fell overboard and was consumed by a shark. And at this moment, when people from Europe were going out and you know, again, sailing into the Pacific and sailing, of course, to the New World, you saw just account after account of sharks as the sailor's enemy. And really, there was no redeeming aspect of sharks. They were seen as the thing that would strike. It was interesting. In many cases, you'd see sailors write about how the people running the ships didn't care about the sailors, and therefore they wouldn't even warn them if they had a shark in the water. And these creatures went from being totally obscure to being painted by, for example, John Singleton Copley. Many of you might be aware of Watson and the Shark, which is interesting because it is both, of course, an iconic image of Brooke Watson, who, as a 14-year-old orphan, was in the port of Havana, fell overboard, and lost part of one leg to the shark. But one of the interesting things about the story is this was also a moment, this is in the late 1700s, that painting was 1778, is that actually Brooke Watson used his shark attack as a source of self-promotion. He commissioned Copley to do this painting, by all accounts, although it's a little iffy on the records. And essentially he was a wealthy London merchant who had political aspirations. And he commissioned this painting in part to create a myth about how he had been saved by God when he was in the maws of the shark. And so at that moment, humans had begun to use sharks to basically acquire prestige. Now, there's a lot of debate about their name. You know, some think it's the Anglo-Saxon term charon, which means to cut or tear, or the English term to search, or the French chercher. But really, the most realistic interpretation of and argument for where it comes from, it actually comes from a Humboldt State University professor named Tom Jones, who says it came from the Mayan word shock, which is X-O-C. And it was really sailors who were sailing under the British Captain John Hawkins, who it's agreed that he's the one who introduced shark, S-H-A-R-K-E, to the British world, that they were actually sailing in the Yucatan. They ran into trouble. They had a disastrous voyage there. A Spanish wine ship captain from the Yucatan used that term, most likely, and that's how they came to do it. Now, the Mayans didn't have great views of sharks either. They had creatures named, it's like Ashok and Akanshok and others, and it's described as an ominous demon that killed and devoured women and children. So, it's really, the jury was done. They had given their verdict. And so one of the interesting things is in any language you find, shark has negative connotations. It became synonymous with the word predator, like in 1713 when the Guardian referred to, quote, the sharks who prey upon the inadvertency of young heirs. By 1806, it became another term for lawyers, which I'm sure many of us know here. But, my profession wasn't immune. By 1828, a British writer used it to describe a gang of reporters. Americans added a twist in 1946 by applying it to anyone who displayed lechery when seeking a romantic liaison, and the German word for villain is shirk. So it was really, seen as a threat to us, but also a somewhat abstract threat, a threat that, again, seamen who went out would, encounter these sharks, and it was a threat to them. Actually, interestingly, of course, slaves fell victim to shark attacks as well, and in fact, a British abolitionist who was criticizing the shark trade actually gave a speech in Parliament in which he said, he gave it from the perspective of sharks, saying that if you abolish slavery, then how would they have food to eat? Because they couldn't prey upon the slaves who were thrown overboard, which is in fact true. I mean, that definitely happened during the slave trade. But again, it wasn't seen as really having personal resonance. But for Americans, the summer of 1916 was the critical turning point where there was a series of shark attacks. This ultimately was the inspiration for the novel Jaws off the New Jersey shore, where there were a series of attacks over 12 days where 4 people were killed. And this was the moment where it became common perception that by going in the water and bathing, which had become a common pastime, that you yourself could be attacked by a shark. And it's interesting, I just, again, unconsciously use the term attack, but what's really interesting is when you look at the language, particularly from the turn of the century to a few decades later, the terminology for what happened when a shark bit a human changed. So essentially, it started out being they were called shark accidents. And this is one of the there's an interesting PhD student named Christopher Neff who's been doing research on this in Australia. And so between 1919 and 1932, for example, there were 33 shark bite incidents, if you want to call them, in Australia, 24 of which were lethal. So that's roughly a 3/4 mortality rate for an attack. Just to put it in perspective, at this point, you have a 90% chance of survival if you're attacked by a shark. So the New South Wales Committee the New South Wales government created the Shark Menace Committee, which was to investigate and issue a report about these accidents, which obviously were causing public alarm and were a huge deal. Now, interestingly, they used the term accident 6 times and attacks 5 times. So really, they used them interchangeably, but it was clear that they weren't putting some sort of intentionality on the shark. And it was really an individual, a Sydney surgeon named Victor Coppelson, who became the world's foremost shark expert at the time. And he's the one who transformed the language. Early on, even he referred to as accidents. He wrote in his materials, having examined people who were attacked, that that these weren't done on purpose. But over time, he came to be convinced that in fact sharks were out to get us. That he came up with the rogue shark theory of they're swimming around and some of them are extremely hungry and they're going to come after you until they eat you. And he published a 1958 book called Shark Attack, which crystallized this. And that's really the point where shark attack became the terminology. It's very interesting. This academic, Christopher Neff, likes to say that when it comes to shark attacks, we're in the way but not on the menu, which is one of the best ways to kind of put this in perspective. These things are, again, inevitably accidents where they're mistaking humans for actual prey, but nonetheless they take a human toll, and that's obviously what raises concerns. So then you come to Jaws. Jaws was obviously just really, it was amazing in the sense that Peter Benchley managed to tap into this primordial fear that we have about sharks and was able to convince literally a global audience that that sharks could strike at any time. And I think this is one of the things that's most compelling about why we say fear sharks, even more than we might fear grizzly bears or lions or tigers. Those are also top predators on land, on land rather than sea, but we can see them coming for better or worse. It's rare that you would have a total surprise attack by, say, a grizzly bear. But with sharks, they inevitably are unseen, that they're coming from below. That is how most of them attack. And that there's something profoundly scary about the idea that there's an unseen predator that can take such a bite out of us. So once we came to the perception that sharks were out to get us, it of course became okay to kill them. And it became an accepted recreational sport. Again, if you look in the 50s, that's really where it took off, in areas around here as well as off Long Island. And now this is a booming business. I spent time with someone who calls himself Mark the Shark in Miami Beach, who 365 days a year, often twice a day, he takes out a huge number he takes groups out to where he basically sets everything up so that he is going to catch a major shark and then hands it over to the kind of, usually it's the guy who's getting married in a bachelor party, it's the young woman who's convinced her family to go on his boat, and they haul up a shark that is much larger than them, take the pictures, and while they throw that shark overboard, because one thing that's really interesting is sharks, aren't even used for the trophies anymore. You go in and you say, I caught a hammerhead that was 6 feet long, and they come up with the fiberglass frame and do it for that. So they don't even mount these sharks, and most of them don't, frankly, take pictures and don't even do anything with them. But that's immediately what happens. But you get your bragging rights and you move on. And while recreational fishing, for example, in the United States, kills roughly 200,000 sharks a year, that's not the primary driver of why sharks are in trouble at this point. Industrial fishing has taken an enormous toll on them. What's happening is not as much, in this case, they're often caught as bycatch, if some of you are familiar with this. They're accidentally caught when tuna and swordfish longliners set out their lines and put the same kind of bait that any shark's going to take. And this kills certainly tens of millions of sharks a year. There aren't very good statistics on it, partially because people aren't counting, they're just moving on. And sometimes they throw it overboard, sometimes they might take the fins, but as a result, it's very difficult to get a precise figure, but it's definitely taking an impact. But shark's fin soup is probably the greatest threat that sharks face at this time. And it's interesting because shark's fin soup, which some of you might be familiar with, is incredibly, it's been eaten in China for forever, and in many Chinese societies for hundreds of years. Ironically, what happened is there was at one point a Chinese explorer who came back, and he went out to Africa. He came back with sharks, and they were eating the meat at that time, and he had to do something with these fins. And so in fact, they cultivated a delicacy which traditionally was for elites. It went out of favor during the Cultural Revolution under Mao, and it was in fact not something that was widely eaten. But in a sign of how globalization really is affecting a lot of things when it comes to the environment, once you had capitalism reintroduced to China, what happened is it became a matter of prestige. Again, the idea that you can serve shark's fin soup is something that shows that both you're willing to pay the money to do this because it's very expensive, but also that in a certain indirect way you have conquered this enemy of ours that's in the sea. And so shark's fin soup has become much more prevalent. It's something that's considered essential at any decent wedding, both in China itself and again in many societies where there are significant Chinese populations like Singapore. And it's become something that's incredibly prevalent, and as a result we've had a huge explosion in the number of sharks that are targeted for their fins. It's, again, while the estimates range up to 73 million sharks a year are targeted. So again, put that in perspective, you have between somewhere around 80 to 100 million sharks a year that are being killed, and roughly 4 to 5 people die worldwide from shark strikes every year. And what's also interesting is that while the trade is centered in Asia, and specifically Hong Kong is where most of the shark fins go through at one point, often on the way to China or to, again, a country with a significant Chinese population, the sharks are being taken from all over the world. So I would go to Belize to the fishing market in the morning, and there would be a woman who had already told told her fins, and she was waiting to sell the shark meat. Or I'd be in a tiny village off the coast of Baja California in Mexico, and as soon as they dragged in the blue and mako sharks, the first thing they cut off were the fins, which were going to go for more than 10 times the price of the meat. The meat they could sell locally. Mexico is actually one of the few countries that actually still eats shark meat as a primary, fish. But it was the fins that they knew that could be dried, that could be shipped globally, that were going to really get them money. And ironically, this is at a moment that we're really at the cusp of a golden era of scientific discovery when it comes to sharks. And this was one of the reasons that I became interested in writing this book, that I was learning about what science we were discovering about sharks. And so it's everything from Isla Holbox, Mexico, which is a sleepy Mexican town that actually has become a tourist mecca, where they're studying whale sharks, the biggest sharks in the sea. There's a picture of that on the slideshow. And these are filter feeders. They're enormous, but they consume more than 2,000 calories a day in tiny, tiny plankton and other small marine creatures. And they've just started learning how the fact is that they use a filtration system that might be similar to what we use in soda bottling, but might be better, and things that we can understand about filtration that we never had before because it had been very difficult to study them. Then in Raja Ampat, Indonesia, on the other side of the globe, what they're doing is discovering new species because they have an opportunity to go in there in a way that they hadn't before. This is actually, some of you might be aware that Indonesian Papua is an area where there's actually been a lot of political strife over time. So both when the Dutch controlled it and then later when the Indonesian government took over, they really made it off limits to scientists. And it's only now that scientists are getting in there and in fact discovering new forms of new species of sharks, including what they call the Raja Ampat walking shark, which in fact uses its pectoral fins, it's an epaulet shark, to propel itself along the ocean floor. We're also learning how we can take elements of sharks in order to make new scientific inventions, such as the fact that one, for example, National Geographic scientist was looking at how a remora fish, which is kind of a fish that has a symbiotic relationship with sharks, was attached to a shark and came up with a camera, which is now called Critter Cam, where they actually attach this to, it's not just sharks, but all sorts of animals, and are able to learn things that they wouldn't be able to do because they're able to record observations. They use this on blue whales, they use this on terrestrial animals, and again, it was through learning it by actually observing how sharks live. There's also incredible advances that have been done in terms of satellite technology, and so we have a sense of how long sharks are diving, how deep they're diving, where they're going to feed, to some extent where they're going to mate, and so all of these things have just become possible in the last few years. I mean, literally what we know now compared to 5 years ago about sharks, there's a tremendous difference. We're also understanding their role in the food chain and the fact that they play the same role that top predators play when you're talking about the lions and tigers on the savannah, or you're talking about wolves in Yellowstone. They really keep mid-level predators in check, which allows for example, healthy coral reefs, because you can have some of the smaller predators that are essential for eating vegetation off corals. And so in all these ways, we're having a better sense of why sharks matter in the ocean. And so what has happened is there's actually a shark lobby that now exists, not like all those other lobbies in Washington that also have shark-like aspects, but this one is very focused on shark conservation. And one of the interesting things is they've made some advances, and they've also run into some significant obstacles. So now that we have a better sense of how many sharks are imperiled at this point, the best estimates that we get from the International Union for Conservation of Nature are that roughly 1/3 of all shark and ray species, rays which are related to sharks, but in cephalopods, are in danger of extinction. And so there's been a renewed push really in international forums to try to get protections. Right now there are only, for example, 3 species of sharks that enjoy international trade protections. That's great whites, basking sharks, and whale sharks. And then every other species, including some species that have had 90, even 99% declines, like the oceanic whitetip, have no protections internationally. And this is a huge problem, particularly because many sharks can travel so far. Obviously, there are some that stick to the coast, but some are capable of traversing ocean basins, so if you don't have international protections, you really are out of luck. So in a lot of these international forums, and I should say that the United States has been pretty aggressive in trying to get some of these protections. They've run up by, to significant resistance. Interestingly, a lot of the resistance has come from Japan, even though, say, China is a much larger consumer of sharks. And that often comes from the fact that the Japanese society is a fishing society. They traditionally have rejected any limitations on marine species internationally. It's psychologically, it's something that they're really not that comfortable with. They often make allegiances with, say, the Chinese, or interestingly, with small island nations. So, for example, last year there was an enormous push to, for example, protect a few different species, including porbeagle sharks, several species of hammerheads. And ultimately, it was China and Japan opposed the protections, but ironically, it was small island nations who really took up the fight and said, we need these for our, we need this for our survival. We're ocean-going peoples, and you can't take our right to kill sharks. And so right now there's somewhat of a standoff, although there have been some modest restrictions on shark fishing that, for example, were adopted a few months ago. And so there's a little bit of advancement there. And there's actually really significant progress that's happening right now on the state level in the United States. The U.S., again, has fairly strong shark protective measures. There was just a bill that passed last December. It was one of the last things Congress did before adjourning, which provided some measures that said that if you landed a shark, you had to have its fins attached, and that's something that really discourages the shark fin trade, because it's a lot easier to just cut off the fins and store them in your boat. They don't take up as much room, and you can kill a lot more sharks. So if you have to take all the shark, it really takes up more room, and you take fewer sharks. But what's happening on the state level is that there, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, we've seen a resistance to the idea of buying shark fins outright and using them in shark fin soup. So Washington last month, this is all just happening right now, enacted a law that banned the sale and possession of shark fins. It's passed, the same measure has passed both chambers of Oregon, and it's just waiting for the governor's signature. And in California, which is clearly the most significant because it has two of the biggest Chinese markets outside of Asia, a similar bill passed the California State Assembly a couple weeks ago and is likely to become law by the end of the summer. So one of the interesting things is that, the approach that some activists have taken here is, why not attack the source of the drive of the demand? And if you cut down the demand for shark fins, that might be one of the best things you can do for sharks. There's also an effort, which is interesting, to change just the culture of shark fishing, which again is still alive and well. There are tons of kill tournaments for sharks up and down the East Coast, for example. Ones that, for example, Peter Benchley's widow, Wendy, has tried unsuccessfully to stop right here, off the Cape. And so what's interesting is that there are people who are trying to convert these to catch and release. It's the idea that you're going from primitive pride to the thrill of discovery, that you can actually measure your own shark, they'll tag it, they'll track it, and that can this really change the way we're viewing sharks? And it's interesting, so they've done this in, for example, Florida. They're talking about doing it in other places, and that's one interesting development. In a lot of these developed countries where they really do depend on sharks economically, what's happening is an exploration of whether ecotourism is going to be an alternative generator of income. And so what you're seeing is in Mexico, for example, in Baja California, they're debating whether to do this, whereas on the other side, off the Yucatan, this town that I mentioned earlier, Isla Holbox, the entire town runs on the whale shark tourism. It's the easiest one you can market because it's warm and cuddly and it's got polka dots and it doesn't eat any humans whatsoever. And so their entire economy at this point has gone from a fishing and primarily shark fishing economy to one that basically survives on tourists coming because they want to see big whale sharks in the water. And even in South Africa, you're seeing a shift in attitudes, which is very interesting because the South Africans have legitimate reasons to be concerned about shark attacks. Great whites off the coast of Cape Town in the Eastern Cape absolutely continue to attack humans. And so they've been very creative. They've tried things like they have a system of shark spotters that they've established where they hire people to stand up on cliffs and watch and provide signals and indicate below how dangerous it is to be out in the water, whether they see a shark and then they shut down the beach. And it works some of the time, but it doesn't work all of the time. So for example, there has been within the last year a shark attack off the Cape, and that's one of these moments where we're really tested in terms of our perception and our relationship wilderness and to wild animals. That essentially, are we comfortable having animals exist that absolutely pose a lethal threat, but at the same time provide such a critical role in the ocean? There are also some questions about actually whether there's too much shark love going on, in the sense of, for example, in Belize, where whale sharks come regularly when red snapper are spawning, because that's an incredible moment where they can get fish eggs that are fantastic for them. There's so many tourists that are going there right now. There's some concern that the sharks may end up having to migrate somewhere else, and they may skip spending time in this area because they're around humans so much. So one of the really difficult questions is, again, how can we renegotiate this role, and to what extent can we be up close with sharks, or do we need to keep them at a distance? And so that brings me to the idea of marine reserves, which is something that has been done here and in other parts of the world, where you're actually putting some areas of the ocean off limits to fishing, and to some extent you're even restricting, say, recreational diving there. And this is a very tough choice. It's easy to do it in some remote areas. Actually, George W. Bush, not necessarily known for his environmental record, did more to protect ocean areas through marine reserves than any of his predecessors or than President Obama. He created a huge national monument in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, as well as ones in the Line Islands and in the Marianas Trench in the Pacific. Now, this was easy for him to do because these are places that, again, no one in this room most likely is going to go to. These are incredibly remote areas that are biologically diverse, and it's important that you protect them, but you're usually not goring anyone's ox when you're doing something like this. The tougher question, of course, is going to be, are there places closer to shore, even close to this shore, where people would be comfortable doing marine reserves? One interesting thing that's happening right now is that when Bush created his first national monument in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, it was the largest marine reserve in the world. And what you've seen is essentially a macho competition among many male leaders about whether they can create the biggest marine reserve. So, for example, Gordon Brown of Britain one-upped him. He created the then largest marine reserve in the world in the Chagos Islands in the Pacific. It looks like New Zealand is going to top both of them. And Nicolas Sarkozy of France, who can never be underestimated for his need to impress people with his male prowess, is likely to try to cobble together several different marine reserves from French exclusive economic zones that could ultimately end up surpassing all of them. And so that's really one of the places where we are seeing positive action and an opportunity for sharks to really be in their natural element, and frankly be much more prevalent than any of us would be comfortable with being quite close. And so in the end, really what I think we're looking at is, again, this question about how committed are we to having something that on one level is our enemy exist. And I think that we really are at a moment where we are reassessing the extent to which we can coexist with something which in many ways is an entirely different being. It operates differently. It is not, these are, for example, sharks abandon their young. There's really very little that is warm and cuddly about sharks. And I don't ever want to leave people with the impression that somehow they're misunderstood in the sense that they're really much more compassionate or somehow endearing in a certain way. It's actually their unbelievable ability to be predators and to survive for hundreds of millions of years, to a large extent unchanged, that makes them so valuable. And that's really what we're going to have to decide in the coming years. And how we come to that conclusion is really going to have a huge impact on what kind of oceans we have, not only now, but in the future. And so that's my overview. And then I would love to take questions. And there were beautiful pictures, which you can see on you can also go to demonfishbook.com, and I have a slideshow of many, many fantastic sharks on my website if you want to see it there. So at that point, what I'd love to do is open it up for questions. I'm sure there are some good questions. And in fact, yes, right there.
You talked a lot about how they're setting up marine protection zones for these animals, and countries are starting to pass laws, which is fantastic, but I'm wondering to what extent they are actually funding protection or security to ensure that those laws are actually obeyed?
That's a really interesting question. So part of it is, again, with certain areas, they're so remote that on one level it's it's easier to do it. For example, with the Chagos Islands, it's so difficult to get to, or the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It's something that it's also the northwestern Hawaiian Islands have the advantage that the closest island is Midway, and so we have a military presence there, and so to some extent we have a built-in enforcement mechanism there as opposed to some of these areas in the Pacific. There's a really interesting professor named Daniel Pauly who's done a lot of work on this, and one of his arguments is you really can have bigger having a huge marine reserve is easier to enforce because through satellite imagery you can track it. And for example, it's with smaller reserves, for example, fishing vessels can dip in and out and they can do it very quickly. But for some of these areas, it takes so long to get to them that you can stop someone before they actually get there, or certainly before they get to some of the most valuable areas. But I think this is a really, it's a legitimate question, and it's certainly, I know with the Chagos Islands, the former British colony where they've created a marine reserve, there's some serious questions of, particularly in an area where the British government is doing incredible cuts to their budgets at this point, that on a certain level there may not be the enforcement that one would like. But I think there's a sense that with some of these places you can do it, and with others you really do need to have enforcement. And I should also add that, for example, one of the things that I write about in my book is in Indonesian Papua. For example, there were two major environmental groups, Conservation International and the Nature Conservancy, and they came in and they found these incredible areas that hadn't been explored, and they found all these species, and they said, we want you to make these marine reserves. There it's very interesting because the tribes have land rights, and then they have rights over reefs. That's actually a tribal right that you have, and they could say what would happen to those reefs. So what they convinced the people in some of these villages to do in Wago is that they said, we will hire your villagers to enforce fishing restrictions in these areas if you're willing to do it. Now granted, they can only do that for a limited period of time, but what they did is they've hired people to police the reefs by putting some areas off limits. There's plenty of scientific evidence that then you have healthier and larger fish populations that end up spilling over to where there is fishing. And so now these villagers see that there's an economic incentive to protect these areas because they're doing better fishing than they've ever done before. And this is actually, they've had several years of this, they've had something like 3 years, so they have the data at this point. So now the local villages are invested in policing it for their own right. And while they're still, getting subsidized by these two American organizations, at some point they may see it in their own self-interest to do it. And so that's certainly one of the things that's being explored. But one interesting thing is to get money initially to do that enforcement. They auctioned off the name of the walking shark that I mentioned. It got named for a guy named Jeff Galley, whose wife paid $500,000 to name a shark after her husband. And there was a lot of controversy over that. Should you allow someone to have this vanity name for a shark? But it was $500,000 that went directly into protecting this area, and so those are some of the choices that people are making in order to address some of the concerns that you're raising. Yes.
Hi, Juliette. Nice to see you. I'm Heather Tassig and lead our conservation initiatives here at the Aquarium. And the one thing I wanted to add to your question was that we've been involved with establishing a very large marine protected area in the Pacific called the Phoenix Islands,
of course,
in association with Conservation International. And one thing that's been an interesting lesson for us is that this is surrounding a small island nation named Kiribati, and very reliant on the revenues from fishing vessels and licensing foreign fishing fleets to fish in those areas. So they undertook a very sort of innovative way to protect this area, and it leads back to the enforcement question, which is, can they create an endowment where essentially they forego those fishing license revenues in order to be able to support the country that relies on that income, and be able to also pay for the enforcement and a whole management plan around that. So, there have been some really interesting conversations at the international level about engaging, for instance, New Zealand and Australia in overflights in terms of those areas. And I would just say that enforcement and monitoring is one really big issue for large MPAs. And there was just a meeting last December in Hawaii and established a big ocean network, which is essentially the Great Barrier Reef and Chagos and a number of the Phoenix Islands and a number of other MPAs that are trying to grapple with how to share lessons learned among these large MPAs and be able to think creatively about how to address things like enforcement and the challenges they face. So there's a lot of information now about that.
It's true. Greg Stone here, who is a source for my book, has done wonderful work. And one of the issues is there's some of it, in fact, there was a beautiful picture where it was all the sharks that were together and there was kind of a sandy bottom. that another biologist took that in the Millennium Atoll, which is part of this area, but it's one that hasn't received, it's under Kiribati control and it hasn't received protection. And so they're really, as you can see, really incredible places where there's an effort to kind of protect them before it's too late. Sorry.
I just was wondering a little bit more of your thoughts of countries and situations like the Galapagos where they have World Heritage Site, but that the government's actually contributing towards the shark finning population. As divers, a lot of us are aware that they cut the number of permits to go out and dive, and the theory in the dive community is that it's because the divers were reporting all the illegal finners out there. And so that's one of the theories, because we all know they're finning out in the Galapagos, which is supposedly a protected area, and that the government's in on it.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, it doesn't surprise. Well, I have not heard that particular account. It doesn't surprise me. I talked to one of the former ministers of environment in Ecuador for my book, asking her about the Galapagos, and one of the things she said is she had real problems because basically the fishermen's lobby there, like I would note, fishermen's lobbies in the United States, is incredibly powerful, and there they really can deliver votes in a way that is actually, the fishermen's lobby in the United States is not that huge, although it does have a disproportionate impact on certain members of Congress. And in that instance, she tried to get the data on some of these issues, and she literally couldn't get her own people to give her the data, she certainly couldn't get the president to listen to her because he cared more about whether those people were going to deliver votes to him in the Galapagos, and so that that's a significant.
I had heard that their World Heritage Site was in status was in sort of flux because of that. Okay. It makes me wonder what, if anything, we can do to risk their tourism money.
That's a really interesting thing. I mean, I definitely think you're bringing up actually an interesting point, which is there's kind of a new look at what sharks can bring you alive rather than dead. So, for example, some of you might have seen that there's a study that just came out of Australia, the Palau, which is the first country to create a shark sanctuary where there's no shark fishing in their waters. That they determined that a reef shark over the course of its life brings $1.9 million in tourism in terms of divers and swimmers and snorkelers, as compared to 100,000, 200,000 if you just took its fins. And so part of it is I think that there's an emphasis on trying to crunch those numbers and use them in economic as economic arguments for public policy making. And we're also seeing that in the Bahamas, which is on the cusp of instituting a ban on commercial shark fishing, just on the grounds that it would hurt their tourism, and that's a bigger driver of their GDP.